Through the Pixelated Lens by Edwina Longbottom, prologue. The Seeds of a Warrior. Alex Carlson grew up in Boise, Idaho, a curious and thoughtful child. She spent hours glued to science documentaries and books about explorers who dared to challenge the unknown. Her parents, Hannah and Mark, worked hard to provide a steady life, Hannah as a nurse and Mark as a mechanic. They valued independence and honesty, qualities they sought to instill in Alex. Life in Boise was steady, but unremarkable. Alex found her excitement in long summer days with her cousin Kevin, who lived just a few streets away. Together, they rode bikes through trails, dreamed of far-off places, and built imaginary futures full of adventure. Kevin's adventurous spirit inspired Alex. But when Kevin enlisted in the military, Alex's admiration was tinged with sadness. Their conversations dwindled to sporadic emails after Kevin was deployed overseas. Then, one day, the emails stopped. The wound Alex was in a history lecture when the principal came to the door, summoning her to the office. "Killed in action," the words echoed in Alex's ears, hollow and incomprehensible. At the funeral, military representatives recounted how Kevin had died protecting civilians in an ambush. But to Alex, the explanation felt vague and incomplete, like something was being hidden. In her grief, Alex stumbled upon online forums promising hidden truths about military operations. The conspiracies offered the answers Alex desperately wanted. She dove headfirst into this rabbit hole, devouring videos and articles that claimed Kevin's death was part of a larger, sinister agenda. The Digital Crusader. By the time Alex entered college, her skepticism had hardened into outright distrust of mainstream narratives. Majoring in communications gave her tools to dissect media, but also emboldened her conviction that she alone could uncover the real story. Social media became her battleground. Between classes, Alex created videos debunking lies, offering what she called uncensored truths. Each like, share, and comment became validation, cementing her identity as a digital crusader. At home, tensions grew. "You need to step back," Hannah pleaded during a rare family dinner. "This obsession isn't healthy." Mark, blunt as ever, added, "You can't believe everything you read online." Alex dismissed their concerns, convinced her parents were too entrenched in their biases to see the bigger picture. Chapter 1. Echo Chambers. Alex Carlson adjusted her webcam, angling it to capture the posters on the wall behind her. "Truth Warriors Unite," and "Question Everything." The 19-year-old college sophomore from Boise, Idaho, had carved out a niche as a social media crusader. Her desk was cluttered with printouts of conspiracy theories, half-empty coffee cups, and sticky notes scrawled with research. At the center of the chaos was her laptop, the portal to a world where Alex's opinions mattered more than facts. Her latest post was gaining traction, a video montage of missile strikes in Ukraine, overlaid with ominous music and bold text proclaiming the truth the media won't tell you. The footage was heavily edited, cobbled together from dubious sources. The comment section buzzed. Finally, someone exposing the lies. "Keep it up, Alex. You're waking people up. This is what they don't want us to see." Alex leaned back, satisfied. Her following wasn't massive, but it was loyal. She saw herself as a digital David against the Goliath of mainstream media. A knock at the door broke her focus. Jamie, Alex's roommate, entered, arms crossed. "Another post, huh? You ever think about fact-checking any of this stuff?" Alex shrugged. "Fact-checking is just another tool for censorship. I'm exposing the narrative." Jamie sighed, shaking her head. "You're not exposing anything, Alex. You're just regurgitating propaganda." "Propaganda!" Alex spun her chair around, affronted. "I'm questioning everything. That's what freethinkers do." "Whatever," Jamie said, walking out. "Just remember, real lives are on the line." Alex scoffed, but felt a flicker of doubt. It was quickly drowned out by the thrill of seeing her follower count tick upward. Chapter 2. The Glitch. That night, Alex sat in her dorm room, the glow of the laptop screen casting a pale light across her cluttered desk. Notifications pinged relentlessly, likes, shares, comments, all fueling the self-assured narrative Alex had built around herself as a truth-teller. Scrolling through her feed, Alex smirked at a freshly posted infographic proclaiming that the war in Ukraine was a staged event orchestrated by global elites. The graphics were absurd, arrows pointing to inconsistencies in video footage, pixelated outlines of supposed green screens, and bold captions declaring that no missiles had actually struck civilian areas. The comments were a cacophony of agreement. Finally, someone exposing the truth. Wake up, sheep. It's all a distraction to hide the New World Order. Alex didn't doubt any of it. In her mind, the world was controlled by an unseen cabal, a shadowy group of billionaires, tech moguls, and government officials. She was convinced the media was a weapon used to manipulate the masses into compliance. It hadn't started with Ukraine. Alex's journey into conspiracy theories had been gradual but relentless, each wild idea building on the last. She believed 9/11 was an inside job, orchestrated to justify wars in the Middle East. Climate change? A hoax designed to impose global carbon taxes. The moon landing? Filmed on a Hollywood soundstage. COVID-19? A ploy to implant tracking microchips through vaccines. People are so blind, Alex muttered, clicking through a video titled The Real Reason Behind the Ukraine War. The video was a bizarre montage. Heavily edited news clips, ominous music, and an authoritative-sounding narrator explaining that the war was a pretext for the US and NATO to seize control of Ukraine's vast natural resources. Alex leaned back in her chair, letting the words wash over her like gospel. She didn't need to fact-check. It all fit perfectly into the narrative she had been piecing together for years. But the conspiracy that resonated most deeply was the one claiming Russia's actions in Ukraine were noble. According to Alex's preferred sources, Russia was liberating Ukraine from Western-backed fascists. Civilians caught in the crossfire were either actors or collateral damage exaggerated by the media. People think Putin is the villain, Alex said aloud to no one. But he's standing up to the real villains, global elites trying to enslave us all. Her confidence in this narrative had grown after hours spent in online echo chambers, where like-minded individuals reinforced each other's beliefs. Facts didn't matter. What mattered was the thrill of feeling smarter than everyone else. Alex's favorite theory of all was one she had posted about just days before. It claimed that a secret Ukrainian biolab funded by the US was manufacturing deadly viruses, which Russia had heroically destroyed to prevent a global pandemic. The comment section on that post was a wildfire of praise. Finally, someone brave enough to expose this. Alex Carlson, you're a hero. Every like and share was a shot of dopamine. It didn't matter that mainstream outlets had debunked the story. To Alex, the very fact that it had been debunked was proof of its validity. Fact-checkers, Alex scoffed. What a joke. Despite the praise, a tiny voice in the back of Alex's mind whispered doubts. Could I be wrong? Could they all be wrong? But she quickly pushed the thought aside. Doubt was for sheep, not for truth warriors. As the screen flickered, Alex didn't notice at first. She was too engrossed in a thread dissecting grainy images of supposed crisis actors in Ukraine, individuals allegedly posing as grieving civilians for Western news cameras. Is this a hack? Alex muttered when the flicker turned into a pulsating glow. The laptop's hum grew louder, vibrating through the desk. Alex leaned in closer, squinting at the screen. What the? Suddenly, the light exploded outward, engulfing the room. Alex's chair toppled back as she felt a sensation like falling, the world spinning and twisting in a dizzying spiral. When she opened her eyes, the familiar hum of the laptop was gone. In its place was an unrelenting cacophony, distant explosions, wailing sirens, and the cries of people in despair. Where am I? Alex whispered, her voice trembling. The air was heavy with smoke and ash, the cold biting through her thin hoodie. Around her stretched a desolate landscape of bombed-out buildings and shattered glass. The lies she had so fervently believed now felt as fragile as the broken city before her. Chapter 3. A New Reality. Alex lay on the cold, cracked asphalt, her head pounding as if she'd been hit by a freight train. She groaned, blinking against the dim, smoky light filtering through a gray, clouded sky. The acrid smell of burning wood and metal filled her nostrils, making her cough violently. For a moment, she stayed still, disoriented and aching, trying to make sense of where she was. The last thing Alex remembered was the laptop screen glowing unnaturally bright, a sudden burst of light, and then this. She sat up slowly, her palms pressing into the rough asphalt. Sharp pebbles and shards of glass bit into her skin, and she winced, brushing her hands against her jeans. The air was colder than expected, biting through her thin hoodie. Around her, The silence was punctuated by distant, rhythmic booms that sent shivers down her spine. What? What the hell? Alex murmured, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Staggering to her feet, she looked around. Her surroundings were a nightmarish collage of destruction. Buildings loomed like skeletal remains, their windows shattered, their facades riddled with bullet holes. Twisted metal beams jutted out of collapsed structures, and the street itself was torn apart, chunks of asphalt missing as if gouged by an angry giant. The ground was littered with debris, broken bricks, splintered wood, charred remnants of what might have been furniture. Alex's eyes caught something that looked disturbingly familiar, a child's stuffed bear, its fur matted with soot and one button eye missing. It lay discarded amid the rubble, its presence both innocent and haunting. Alex bent down, picking it up gingerly. The soft fabric felt wrong in her hands, out of place in this cold, lifeless scene. She turned it over, noticing a patch stitched onto its belly, a sunflower. A sunflower, Alex whispered, the sight stirring something deep and unnameable in her chest. She set the bear down carefully and moved forward, her feet crunching on glass and debris. Each step seemed to bring new horrors into view. A bicycle, its frame bent and wheels warped, leaned against a toppled lamppost. A pair of shoes, small, likely belonging to a child, sat neatly side by side on the edge of a crater, their owner nowhere in sight. As she stumbled further down the street, her eyes landed on a fallen billboard. The once colorful sign, now torn and faded, bore a smiling family holding hands under the words, "Kharkiv, a city of progress and unity." Kharkiv, Alex said aloud, the name stirring faint recognition. She had seen it in news reports, the city at the center of countless headlines. But the Kharkiv she'd seen on her screen looked nothing like this broken, desolate wasteland. Alex's stomach churned as she remembered the video she'd edited, the captions she'd written. Fake news, Ukrainian crisis actors at work. But this wasn't fake. It was visceral, undeniable. Her foot struck something metallic, sending it skittering across the ground with a hollow clang. Alex crouched, picking up the object, a dented tin can, its label scorched beyond recognition. It was still warm, as if recently touched by fire. She stood, turning slowly, trying to make sense of it all. A chill ran down her spine as she realized just how quiet it was. The usual hum of a city, the chatter of people, the rumble of vehicles, was replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence, broken only by the faint echo of explosions in the distance. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the street, carrying with it a sound that made Alex freeze, a soft, almost imperceptible cry. "Hey!" she called out, her voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The cry came again, this time clearer. It was a woman's voice, sharp with urgency. "Hey, you there!" Alex spun around, squinting through the smoke and haze. A figure emerged from behind a pile of rubble. A woman crouched low, her face streaked with soot. She waved frantically, her movements urgent. "Get over here! Now!" She yelled, her voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. Instinct took over. Alex stumbled toward her, her heart pounding as adrenaline surged through her veins. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, littered with obstacles that tripped her at every step. As she approached, an explosion thundered in the distance, sending vibrations rippling through the ground. Alex stumbled, nearly falling, before finally reaching the woman's side. She grabbed Alex's arm and yanked her behind the cover of a collapsed wall. "Stay down," she hissed, her sharp eyes scanning the street. Alex dropped to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pressed her back against the cold, crumbling wall, her mind racing. What's happening?" She managed to stammer, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The woman glanced at her, her expression a mixture of irritation and concern. "What's happening?" she repeated, her tone incredulous. "This is Kharkiv, and if you want to stay alive, you'd better keep your head down." Alex stared at her, her mind reeling. Kharkiv. The name repeated in her head, each iteration driving the reality of the situation deeper into her chest. This wasn't a video. This wasn't a meme or a post to edit. This was real, and Alex was in the middle of it. Chapter 4. Into the shadows, Olena, as she introduced herself, led Alex through a labyrinth of destroyed buildings, moving swiftly and silently. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, and the distant sound of artillery fire punctuated the oppressive silence. Alex stumbled after her, struggling to keep up, her heart pounding in her chest. Keep your head low, Olena hissed, glancing back at Alex. Her sharp eyes scanned their surroundings with practiced caution. Stay close, there are eyes everywhere. They ducked into a half-collapsed basement, where a small group of survivors huddled together. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern, its weak light casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew and fear. Alex's gaze darted around the room. Gaunt faces, hollowed eyes, and makeshift bedding fashioned from tattered blankets filled the cramped space. A toddler whimpered in her mother's arms, her tiny fists clutching a threadbare toy. An elderly man sat silently in a corner, his hands trembling as he muttered prayers under his breath. "Who is she?" an older man asked in Ukrainian, nodding toward Alex. His tone was wary, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Stranger from nowhere," Olena replied, switching to English for Alex's benefit. Clueless, but harmless. Alex opened her mouth to protest, but stopped herself. She could feel the weight of their stares, their fear and mistrust pressing down on her like a physical force. She dropped her gaze, sinking onto the cold floor, overwhelmed by the oppressive weight of the room. The walls were scarred with bullet holes, dark streaks of soot marking where fires had once raged. Alex hugged her knees to her chest, her mind racing. Just hours ago, she had been sitting in her dorm room, surrounded by the glow of her laptop. Now she was here, wherever here was, surrounded by people whose pain and suffering were palpable. I don't understand," Alex stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was in my room. This can't be real." "It's real enough for us," Olena said sharply, her expression hard. A scuffling sound near the entrance drew Alex's attention. A boy, no older than 14, entered carrying a bundle of firewood. His face was pale and smudged with dirt, but his expression was calm, almost detached. He moved with an efficiency that spoke of survival rather than choice. "This is Misha," Olena said, softening her tone as she gestured toward the boy. "He helps us. Don't bother him with questions. He's been through enough." Misha set the firewood down near a crude stove fashioned from salvaged metal and turned to face the room. His gray-blue eyes swept over Alex briefly, his expression unreadable, before he busied himself with stoking the small fire. The orange flames flickered to life, casting a fragile warmth across the cold basement. Alex watched him, unsure of what to say or do. Her presence here felt intrusive, as if she were an unwelcome outsider in a world she couldn't begin to understand. The weight of her ignorance pressed heavily on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Olena knelt beside the fire, her movements deliberate and efficient. "You'll stay here tonight," she said without looking up. "But if you want to survive, you'll have to learn quickly. This is no place for the naive." Alex nodded numbly, her mind still struggling to process the enormity of what was happening. She felt small and insignificant, a spectator in a tragedy she had never truly believed was real. Her gaze flicked to Misha, who was carefully feeding small sticks into the fire. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, yet there was a quiet resilience in his demeanor that Alex couldn't ignore. For the first time, she wondered what stories these walls could tell, what pain and loss had unfolded within their cracked and crumbling confines. And for the first time, Alex began to question everything she thought she knew. Chapter 5: Befriending Misha. The hours crawled by in the dimly lit shelter. Alex sat against the cold, damp wall, her knees pulled to her chest. The faint crackle of the fire in the makeshift stove was the only sound, aside from the occasional muffled rumble of distant explosions. The group of survivors around her spoke in hushed tones, their voices a murmur of Ukrainian that Alex couldn't understand. Her gaze wandered to Misha, the boy who had entered earlier with the bundle of firewood. He sat alone in a corner, his small frame hunched over as he silently chewed on a crust of bread. His face, pale and dirt-smudged, bore an expression of quiet determination, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. Alex hesitated before getting to her feet and walking over to him. She sank to the floor a few feet away, unsure of how to begin. "Hey," she said awkwardly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Alex." The boy looked up briefly, his gray-blue eyes piercing but guarded. "Misha," he said simply, his voice quiet and steady. Alex nodded, unsure what to say next. The silence between them stretched, heavy and awkward. Finally, she asked, "Do you, live here?" Misha's expression darkened. I used to live in a house with my family. His voice was calm, almost detached, but the weight of his words hit Alex like a blow. Now I live wherever there is shelter. Alex felt a lump rise in her throat. She thought of her own family back in Boise, her mom's warm hugs, her dad's jokes, the safety of her childhood home. It was a safety she had always taken for granted, never imagining a world where it could be ripped away. I'm sorry, Alex said softly, feeling helpless. The words sounded hollow, inadequate. Misha shrugged, a gesture far too old for his years. Sorry doesn't bring them back. Alex fell silent, unsure how to respond. She studied the boy's face, noting the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken sorrows. He was just a kid, but there was a steeliness to him that spoke of survival, of resilience forged in the crucible of war. You're strong, Alex said finally, her voice tinged with admiration. Stronger than I'd ever be. Misha glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. For a moment, Alex thought he might say something, but he only nodded before turning back to the fire. As the night wore on, Alex found her gaze drifting back to Misha. She couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, that he used to live in a house with his family. It was such a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything he had lost. In that moment, Alex realized just how little she knew about the world outside her own sheltered bubble. She had spent so much time behind a screen, crafting posts and sharing theories, believing she understood the truth. But here, in this cold, dark shelter, surrounded by people who had lost everything, she felt the full weight of her ignorance. And for the first time, she began to wonder if it was too late to change. Chapter 6. Seeing the City Through Misha's Eyes. The next morning, Elena decided that Alex couldn't stay idle. If you want to survive here, you help, she said curtly, handing Alex a sack of medical supplies. Misha and I will show you what to do. Alex hesitated but nodded, slinging the bag over her shoulder. The idea of venturing back into the ruins of Kharkiv made her stomach churn, but she knew she couldn't refuse. She followed Elena and Misha out of the basement shelter, stepping carefully over the rubble that littered the streets. The morning was cold, the air sharp with the mingling scents of smoke, metal, and frost. Snow had fallen overnight, dusting the ruins with a deceptive sense of peace. But the deeper they walked into the city, the more the devastation revealed itself. Shattered windows gaped like hollow eyes from the shells of once beautiful buildings. Craters from missile strikes marred the streets, their jagged edges filled with dirty slush. Cars lay abandoned, their frames twisted and charred, relics of lives disrupted mid-motion. Misha moved with quiet efficiency, his small frame darting ahead to scout the path. Alex watched him in awe, noting how he seemed to know every safe route, every hidden corner. He navigated the ruins with the ease of someone who had learned to survive in a world that had turned against him. As they passed a playground, Alex stopped in her tracks. The sight before her was like something out of a nightmare. The swings hung limp, their chains twisted and blackened. A seesaw lay on its side, half buried in rubble. The vibrant colors of the equipment were dulled by layers of ash and grime. Misha noticed her hesitation and glanced back. I used to play here, he said softly, his voice devoid of emotion. Alex looked at him, her heart aching. It must have been nice, she ventured, though she felt the inadequacy of her words. Misha didn't respond. His gaze lingered on the swings for a moment longer before he turned and continued walking. They reached a makeshift hospital set up in the basement of an old school. The air inside was thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood. Doctors and volunteers moved with grim determination, their faces pale with exhaustion. Injured civilians lay on cots, their moans of pain a constant undercurrent. Misha lingered near the entrance, his small hands clutching the straps of his oversized coat. Alex knelt beside him, noting the way his eyes darted nervously toward the rows of cots. You okay? She asked gently. I don't like hospitals, Misha murmured, his voice barely audible. Why not? Alex pressed, though she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the answer. Misha's gaze dropped to the floor. They took my sister there, he said finally. She never came back. Alex felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to say something comforting, something to ease the boy's pain, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder, hoping the gesture would convey what she couldn't put into words. Olena returned, her arms loaded with supplies. "We move," she said briskly, her tone leaving no room for argument. She handed Misha a small bundle of bandages and turned to Alex. "Follow me." As they walked back through the ruined streets, Alex found her mind drifting to Misha's words. She couldn't imagine the kind of strength it took to endure what he had been through, to keep moving forward in the face of so much loss. The boy who had once played on these swings, who had laughed and run and dreamed, was now a survivor in a world that had stolen everything from him. For the first time, Alex began to understand the depth of the pain resilience that existed in this city. It wasn't just a headline or a statistic, it was real, and it was human. And it was far more complex than she had ever imagined. Chapter 7, A Bond Forged in Fire. That night, back in the shelter, Alex sat beside Misha, who was carefully fashioning a slingshot from scavenged materials. The boy's hands moved deftly, tying strips of rubber to a piece of bent wood. Despite his young age, there was a precision to his movements that spoke of necessity rather than hobby. His focus was intense, but his eyes betrayed a weariness far beyond his years. Alex watched him in silence for a moment before speaking. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly, breaking the stillness. Misha didn't look up from his work. "You're lost," he said simply. "Someone has to help." The simplicity of his response caught Alex off guard. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the dimly lit room at the other survivors huddled together. The faint crackle of the makeshift stove filled the silence between them. "You've been through so much," Alex said, almost to herself. "I don't understand how you can still be kind." Misha shrugged, his small shoulders rising and falling as if the question didn't matter. "What else is there to be? Angry. It doesn't change anything." Alex fell silent, unsure how to respond. She had spent so much of her life feeding on anger, fueling it in others through her posts, using it as a weapon to push her narratives. But here was a boy who had every reason to be consumed by it, yet chose a different path. After a long pause, Alex asked, "Before all this, what did you want to be? When you grew up?" Misha's hands stilled for the first time, the slingshot resting in his lap. He stared at it as if seeing something far away. "A soccer player," he said finally, his voice soft and tinged with nostalgia. Alex raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Really? Were you good?" A faint smile flickered across Misha's face, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "My father said I was. He used to take me to the park after school. We'd play for hours, just me, him, and the ball. He taught me everything he knew." Alex leaned forward, intrigued. "What position did you play?" "Striker," Misha said, his tone gaining a spark of enthusiasm. "I loved scoring goals. My father would cheer so loud even if there was no one else around. He said I had a killer instinct for the game." Alex could almost see it, the park, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the sound of laughter echoing across the field. It was such a stark contrast to the cold, broken world they now inhabited. "Did you play on a team?" Alex asked. Misha nodded. "At school, we weren't very good, but I didn't care. Playing was enough." He hesitated, his expression darkening. "There was supposed to be a tournament in the spring. But then the war started. The school closed, and the field was bombed. There's nothing left now." The weight of his words settled between them like a stone. "I'm sorry," Alex said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Misha looked at her, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "Sorry doesn't change anything. But it's okay to remember. My father always said that dreams are like seeds. Even if the ground is burned, you can still plant them somewhere new." The wisdom in Misha's words left Alex speechless. Here was a boy who had lost everything, his family, his home, his future, and yet he still clung to the hope that something good could grow from the ashes. Alex found herself wondering if she had ever been that resilient, that wise. "Maybe you'll get to play again," Alex said, her voice filled with a hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Misha smiled faintly. "Maybe, but for now, I make do with what I have." He lifted the slingshot, testing its tension. Alex watched him, feeling a strange mix of admiration and guilt. She had come into this world blind, ignorant of its pain and complexity. Yet here was a boy who had every reason to give up and still chose to keep going. "You matter," Alex said suddenly, the words surprising even her. "Your dreams matter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Misha looked at her for a long moment before nodding. Thank you. As he returned to his work, Alex sat back, her mind churning with thoughts. For the first time, she began to see the people around her not just as survivors of a war, but as individuals with lives and dreams that were worth fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for Alex to start doing something that mattered too. Chapter 8: The Turning Point. The next day, as Alex ventured out with Olena and Misha to deliver supplies, the devastation of Kharkiv stretched out endlessly before them. The streets bore the scars of relentless shelling, craters gaping like open wounds, shattered windows glaring like hollow eyes. The air was thick with the mingling scents of ash, metal, and despair, each breath a reminder of the city's suffering. Alex kept close to Misha, who navigated the ruins with the calm efficiency of someone who had learned to survive in a world that had turned against him. Olena led the way, her movements brisk and purposeful, her expression steeled with determination. As they rounded a corner, Alex's gaze was drawn to something unusual amid the gray, battered facade of a crumbling building. A splash of vibrant color stood out like a beacon, a mural painted on the side of the wall. It was a sunflower, its golden petals bright and defiant against the dull concrete. The vibrant yellow radiated warmth, its green stem reaching skyward, as if it refused to bow to the destruction surrounding it. Alex stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. She stepped closer, the sight pulling her in, silencing the chaos in her mind. "That's Ukraine's flower," Misha said softly, noticing Alex's fixed stare. "It means hope." For a moment, the weight of the war seemed to lift. Alex could see the sunflower not just as a painting, but as a symbol. It wasn't merely an image, it was a statement. The mural spoke of resilience, a refusal to give up, a declaration that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, life could still bloom. The realization hit Alex like a punch to the gut. She had never thought about hope or resilience when she'd crafted her post back home. Her focus had been on validation, on proving herself right, on fueling outrage. Not once had she considered the real human cost of her words, the lives broken, the stories erased, the hope diminished. "Who painted it?" Alex asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one knows," Misha replied. "It just appeared one day. A lot of people come here to see it. Some say it's a sign that we'll survive this." Alex stepped even closer, her fingers brushing the cold, pockmarked wall beneath the painting. The sunflower's petals seemed to pulse with life, a stark contrast to the destruction that surrounded it. For the first time since arriving in Kharkiv, Alex felt the full weight of her ignorance. Every post she had made, every video she had shared, every incendiary comment she had encouraged, it all felt unbearably small and selfish in the face of what this flower represented. "I've been so blind," Alex murmured, her throat tightening as the words escaped her lips unbidden. Misha tilted his head, studying Alex with a quiet intensity. "Blind to what?" "To this," Alex said, gesturing around her. "To everything. I've spent so much time behind a screen, thinking I knew what was going on, but I didn't. Not really." Misha was silent for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. Finally, he said, "Most people don't, but now you're here. You can see." The simplicity of his words struck Alex like a thunderclap. She felt tears welling in her eyes, hot and unbidden. She blinked them back quickly, ashamed of her emotion in the presence of someone who had endured so much more. "Do you think it matters?" Alex asked, her voice trembling. "That I finally see it now? Does it even make a difference?" Misha's expression softened, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It matters. It always matters." Alex stared at the mural again, her chest tightening with a mixture of grief, guilt, and an unfamiliar feeling: hope. For so long, she had used her platform to tear down, to divide, to fuel anger and suspicion. But this flower, painted on a wall that could crumble at any moment, had done more to inspire unity and resilience than she ever had. And that realization, as painful as it was, planted a seed within her, a seed that whispered, "You can still do better." As she turned to follow Misha and Olena, Alex glanced back at the sunflower one last time. It stood as a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was a chance for something good to grow. Chapter 9: The Deserter. The morning was cold and bleak, the sky a dull leaden gray, as Alex and Misha ventured out with Olena to deliver medical supplies to a distant shelter. The streets of Kharkiv, once vibrant with life, were now a haunting mosaic of destruction and silence. Snowflakes drifted in the air, mixing with ash and settling into the jagged cracks of broken roads. Unbeknownst to them, a few blocks away, a man sat huddled in the shadows of a collapsed building. His name was Sergei Petrov, a 28-year-old Russian conscript who had deserted his unit days earlier. His uniform was muddied and torn, the insignias hastily removed. The rifle slung across his back felt like a burden he could no longer bear. Before the war, Sergei had lived a modest life in a small village near St. Petersburg. He had been a schoolteacher, passionate about history and literature. His students admired his ability to make the past come alive with stories, and he found joy in their curiosity. At home, his wife Anya had been his steady anchor, her gentle smile a refuge after long days. Their 5-year-old daughter, Katya, loved nothing more than to sit on his lap as he read her fairy tales, her small fingers tracing the pictures in her favorite books. When the call for mobilization came, Sergei was conflicted. He had no desire to fight, but felt an obligation to serve his country. The state media painted a picture of liberation, of protecting Russian-speaking Ukrainians from oppression. Anya, however, had been skeptical. "Something doesn't feel right about this," she had said, worry lines creasing her forehead. "Stay for us, for Katya." But societal pressures and a sense of duty compelled Sergei to leave. "It will be quick," he had assured her, forcing a smile. "I'll be home before the snow melts." The reality was far from what he had been led to believe. Upon crossing the border into Ukraine, Sergei was confronted with scenes that tore at his conscience. Villages decimated, civilians displaced, and fear etched into the faces of those they were supposedly there to protect. One evening, his unit received orders to secure a small town rumored to harbor resistance fighters. As they advanced, Sergei witnessed his comrades engaging not with armed militants, but with unarmed civilians. An elderly man approached them, hands raised, speaking rapidly in Ukrainian, a language Sergei barely understood. "Stand down," his commanding officer barked, but the tension escalated. A shot rang out, and the old man fell. Chaos erupted, and Sergei's world tilted. This wasn't defense, it was aggression. The ideals he had held crumbled under the weight of the atrocity he had just witnessed. That night, under the cover of darkness, Sergei made the decision to desert. Now, hiding amidst the rubble of Kharkiv, hunger gnawed at his insides, and exhaustion clouded his mind. He clutched a worn photograph of Anya and Katya, the edges frayed from constant handling. The thought of their faces kept him anchored, a reminder of who he used to be. A faint sound stirred him from his reverie, the crunching of debris under cautious footsteps. Sergei tensed, holding his breath. Peering through a gap in the rubble, he saw a boy, perhaps 14, edging closer. His clothes were worn, his eyes sharp with both fear and determination. "Do you hear that?" the boy whispered to someone out of Sergei's line of sight. "Stay here." A woman's voice responded firmly. Sergei knew he couldn't run. He was too weak, and any sudden movement might provoke a confrontation. Summoning what little strength he had, he decided to reveal himself. As the boy drew nearer, Sergei slowly raised his hands, palms open. "Please," he rasped in broken Ukrainian. "I mean no harm." The boy startled but held his ground. Behind him, a teenager and a woman appeared, both wary. The woman stepped protectively in front of the children, her hand gripping a concealed knife. "Who are you?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing. "My name is Sergei Petrov," he replied, switching to halting English upon noticing the teenager's confusion. Was a Russian soldier, but no more. I deserted." The woman, Olena, studied him skeptically. "Why should we believe you?" Sergei lowered his hands slightly. "Because I have nowhere else to go. I left because I couldn't be part of this anymore." The boy, Misha, took a small step forward. "What did you see?" he asked softly. Sergei's eyes met the boy's, and in that moment, he saw a reflection of his own pain. "Things no one should ever see," he admitted. "I was told we were liberators, but all I've witnessed is suffering." Alex watched the exchange, a swirl of emotions churning within her. This was the enemy, the embodiment of the forces she had ignorantly defended online. Yet, standing before her was not a monster but a broken man seeking redemption. Elena glanced at Alex and Misha, then back at Sergei. "If you're lying, it could cost us our lives." "I understand," Sergei said, "but I swear on everything I hold dear, I am telling the truth." A heavy silence settled over them. Finally, Elena nodded curtly. We can't stay here. If you're coming with us, keep up and don't make any sudden moves. Relief flickered across Sergei's face. Thank you, he whispered. As they made their way back to the shelter, Sergei couldn't help but think of his family. He wondered if he would ever see them again, if they were safe, if they would forgive him for the choices he had made. Unbeknownst to him, his path was about to intertwine with Alex's in ways that would challenge everything she thought she knew about enemies, allies, and the true cost of war. Chapter 10: A Soldier's Confession. The shelter was silent except for the faint hum of the lantern casting flickering shadows on the cracked walls. Sergei sat cross-legged near the center of the room, his face drawn and pale. He held a steaming cup of weak tea, his hands trembling slightly. Alex, Elena, and Misha watched him carefully, their expressions a mix of curiosity and guarded suspicion. You said you deserted, Elena began, her voice steady but firm. But why? What did you see that made you leave? Sergei exhaled slowly, staring into his cup as if searching for the words within its depths. At first, I believed the lies, he admitted, his voice low. They told us we were liberating Ukraine, protecting Russian-speaking people from oppression. I thought I was doing something noble. My wife, Anya, she begged me not to go. She said the war felt wrong, unnecessary. He smiled bitterly. She was right. He set the cup down and rubbed his hands together, as if trying to warm away the memories. The first village we entered was quiet, almost too quiet. The houses were intact, but the people were gone, hiding or fled, I don't know. My commander ordered us to search every home, claiming the villagers were harboring resistance fighters. When we found nothing, he grew angry, suspicious. He said the town was too clean, that they must have known we were coming. Sergei's jaw tightened. That night, he ordered us to set fire to the houses. I didn't want to, but refusal meant punishment, or worse. So I followed orders, even as the flames rose and the smell of smoke filled the air. I told myself the village was empty, that no one was harmed, but I knew it was wrong. He looked up, his eyes meeting Alex's. That was the first crack. Alex felt a chill run down her spine. She wanted to look away, to escape the intensity of Sergei's gaze, but she forced herself to listen. The second time was worse, Sergei continued. We were sent to secure a small town. My unit entered cautiously, expecting resistance, but the streets were empty. Then, out of nowhere, an old man appeared. He walked toward us, holding a white cloth in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other. He was trying to offer us food, for God's sake. And yet, Sergei's voice broke. The commander accused him of being a spy. He ordered us to detain him, but when the man didn't understand, when he didn't move quickly enough, one of the soldiers shot him, just like that. Elena stiffened, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the table. The worst part, Sergei said, his voice now barely a whisper, was that no one cared. The others just moved on, like it was nothing. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I couldn't. I was a coward. You weren't a coward, Misha said quietly, surprising everyone. You're here now, aren't you? You left. Sergei smiled faintly at the boy's words, though the pain in his expression didn't fade. The final straw came weeks later. We entered another town, one where people hadn't fled. Families were still in their homes, clinging to whatever normalcy they could. I thought maybe this time it would be different. Maybe we wouldn't destroy everything. He paused, his hands tightening into fists. But then I saw them, the faces of the children, peeking out from behind curtains, their eyes wide with fear. They weren't rebels or threats, they were just children. And yet my commander, he didn't care. He said, "This town is full of traitors. Leave no stone unturned." Sergei's voice cracked. I couldn't do it. I couldn't point my weapon at innocent people anymore. So that night, I slipped away. I don't know how I wasn't caught, but here I am. The room was heavy with silence, the weight of Sergei's words pressing down on everyone. I love Ukraine, Sergei said suddenly, his tone fierce. I always have. My wife has family in Kyiv. I spent summers there as a child. I remember the warmth of the people, the beauty of the land. This war is not what we were promised. It's not what the Russian people want. Most of us hate it. We don't want to fight our neighbors. We want to live in peace. Alex felt a lump rise in her throat. She thought of the posts she had made, the propaganda she had spread, and the picture she had painted of the Russian people as villains. But Sergei wasn't a villain. He was a man caught in a machine far larger than himself, struggling to hold on to his humanity. "Do you think there's a way out?" Alex asked hesitantly. "For the war to end, I mean." Sergei shook his head slowly. "I don't know. But I know that peace starts with understanding. It starts with seeing each other as people, not enemies." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with Alex. For the first time, she began to see the war not as a distant conflict, but as a web of shared pain, fear, and hope. "Thank you," Alex said softly, "for telling us." Sergei nodded. "Thank you for listening. Not everyone wants to." As the night stretched on, Sergei's confession echoed in Alex's mind, planting seeds of doubt, empathy, and an urgent desire to do better. Chapter 11. Shelter and Suspicion. Against Elena's better judgment, she brought Sergei back to the shelter. The group greeted him with unease. Whispers followed him wherever he went, their distrust as palpable as the cold air seeping through the cracked walls. "He's just a spy," an older man muttered in Ukrainian, glaring at Sergei from across the room. His tone was sharp, his suspicion mirrored in the wary glances of others. Alex watched the tension unfold as Misha stepped forward, placing himself protectively near Sergei. His small frame radiated defiance, his voice clear despite its softness. "He's not here to hurt us," Misha insisted, his words spoken in Ukrainian, but his meaning unmistakable to all. "He's like me, he lost everything." The room fell silent at the boy's words. Even the staunchest doubters found themselves hesitating. Alex couldn't help but feel a swell of admiration for Misha. Despite everything he had endured, his capacity for trust and understanding was unshaken. Over the next few days, Sergei worked tirelessly to earn the group's cautious acceptance. He helped reinforce the shelter's defenses, repaired a broken water filter, and even shared what little he had left in his rucksack. A small tin of sardines and a packet of crackers he'd rationed since his desertion. He spent hours mending torn clothing, his needlework surprisingly precise for a man whose hands trembled from fatigue and hunger. When asked about it, Sergei explained with a faint smile, "I learned from my wife. She was much better at it than I'll ever be." One evening, as the group sat around the faint glow of the lantern, Sergei knelt beside a wounded volunteer, cleaning and bandaging her injuries with a careful touch that spoke of experience. "You've done this before," Elena observed, her tone neutral but edged with curiosity. Sergei nodded. "Basic medical training. It's standard for conscripts." He glanced up briefly, his eyes shadowed. "It's one of the few useful things I've taken from all this." Later that night, as most of the shelter slept, Alex found herself sitting beside Sergei near the makeshift fire. The flames danced softly, their light casting shifting shadows on the walls. "Why didn't you just go back to Russia?" Alex asked quietly. Sergei didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I wouldn't have made it far. And even if I did, what kind of man would I be? I've already done so much harm by coming here. The least I can do is stay and try to help." His words resonated with Alex, filling her with a mix of respect and sadness. Sergei was not the enemy she had painted in her mind. He was a man searching for redemption, a man trying to atone for the wrongs he had been part of. And perhaps Alex thought she was searching for the same thing. Chapter 12. Shifting Perspectives. Sergei's presence brought both tension and understanding to the shelter. His stories painted a picture of the war that was far more complex than Alex had ever imagined, challenging the simplistic narratives she had built her online persona upon. As they sat together one evening, Sergei spoke of young conscripts, boys barely older than Misha, sent to the front lines with no training. "They didn't even know how to hold their rifles properly," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "They were terrified, but they didn't dare show it. We all learned quickly that fear could get you killed, whether by the enemy or by your own side." Misha listened intently, his wide eyes betraying a mixture of sympathy and sadness. Alex watched the boy's reaction, feeling a pang of guilt for how she had once dismissed the human cost of war as little more than propaganda. "I didn't think for myself," Sergei admitted one night, his voice quiet but steady. "I believed what they told me because it was easier than questioning it. Questioning meant risking everything, your position, your safety, your family. So I followed orders. I let myself become a part of something I didn't understand." The words struck Alex deeply. She thought of the posts she'd written, the videos she'd shared, and the unwavering confidence with which she had spread her so-called truths. Every like and share now felt like a hollow endorsement of her ignorance. "How do you live with it?" Alex asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Sergei turned to her, his eyes tired but kind. "You don't," he said. "Not really. The memories stay with you, whether you want them to or not. But you try to do better with the time you have left. That's all anyone can do." His words lingered with Alex long after the conversation ended. She found herself questioning not just the war, but her role in perpetuating its misunderstandings. Sergei's courage in facing his past and striving for redemption was humbling, and it made her painfully aware of her own failings. That night, as she lay on the cold floor of the shelter, Alex stared up at the cracked ceiling. For the first time, she began to see the war not as a distant conflict, but as a web of shared pain, fear, and hope, a tragedy with countless lives caught in its grasp. And for the first time, Alex wondered if she could do better too. Chapter 13, A Hard Goodbye. It became clear after a few days that Sergei couldn't stay in the shelter forever. His presence, though appreciated by some, put everyone at risk. Russian patrols still combed the area for deserters, and the longer he stayed, the greater the danger for everyone. One morning, Elena entered the shelter with news. "I've made arrangements," she announced. "There's a group of defectors heading toward a safer region. They'll take Sergei with them." A heavy silence followed her words. Sergei, seated near the fire, nodded solemnly. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Misha's face fell. He had grown attached to Sergei, seeing him as a protector and perhaps a reflection of his own resilience. "Will you be okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with worry. Sergei knelt down to meet the boy's gaze, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "I'll be fine, little one, and so will you. You're stronger than you know." His words were gentle but firm, a reassurance meant to bolster Misha's spirit. When the time came for Sergei to leave, the shelter gathered to see him off. The tension that had initially surrounded him had softened, replaced by a quiet respect for the man who had risked everything to seek redemption. Alex approached Sergei last, struggling to find the right words. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Sergei clasped her shoulder, his grip firm and grounding. "Thank you for listening," he replied. "Not everyone does, and listening, truly listening, is where change begins." As Sergei stepped out into the cold morning light, the gray horizon seemed to swallow him whole. The group watched in silence until he disappeared from view, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. Alex felt a strange mix of sorrow and hope. Sergei's departure left a void in the shelter, but his words and actions had planted something within her, a seed of understanding, of responsibility. For the first time, Alex began to see the world not in terms of enemies and allies, but as a tapestry of lives, each thread woven with its own struggles and dreams. And she resolved, in that quiet moment, to find a way to honor Sergei's sacrifice and the lessons he had taught her. Chapter 14, The Turning Point. Sergei's departure left a palpable void in the shelter. His presence, though brief, had been a source of insight and quiet strength. Alex felt the emptiness acutely, his words echoing in her mind long after he had gone. That night, as she lay on the cold, hard floor, Alex stared at the cracked ceiling. Sleep eluded her, her thoughts swirling with everything she had seen and heard since arriving in Kharkiv. She replayed Sergei's confession, Misha's quiet resilience, and the haunting images of the devastated city. For the first time, Alex allowed herself to sit with the weight of it all. Her mind drifted back to her old life, the laptop screen glowing in her dorm room, the smug satisfaction she felt with each post, each comment that validated her worldview. She had been so confident, so sure of her version of the truth. But now that certainty felt fragile, like a thin veneer that had cracked under the pressure of reality. The posts she had written, the lies she had spread, it all felt unbearably small and selfish in the face of the truth she now knew. She had fueled outrage and division, exploiting tragedy for clicks and shares, all while remaining insulated from the real consequences. "I was wrong," Alex whispered into the darkness. The words hung in the air, heavy with both pain and relief. Elena, lying nearby, stirred at the sound. "What did you say?" she murmured sleepily. Alex hesitated for a moment, then spoke louder, her voice steadier this time. "I said I was wrong, about everything." Olena propped herself up on one elbow, studying Alex in the dim light of the shelter. "It takes strength to admit that," she said simply. "What matters is what you do next." Alex nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of guilt and determination. For so long, she had been part of the problem, but now she had a chance to be part of the solution. The next morning, Alex joined Olena and Misha in their daily routines, distributing supplies, helping where they could. She worked with a newfound sense of purpose, her focus no longer on herself but on the people around her. As the days passed, Alex began to think about what she would do if she ever returned home. Her old life felt like a distant memory, one she wasn't sure she wanted to reclaim. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't go back to who she had been before. When the time finally came for Alex to leave Kharkiv, the goodbyes were bittersweet. Misha hugged her tightly, his small frame trembling. "Don't forget us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't," Alex promised, her eyes brimming with tears. "And I'll make sure no one else does either." As she walked away, the city's scars seemed to etch themselves into her memory. She carried its pain with her, but also its resilience and hope. Back in her dorm room, the familiar glow of her laptop felt strange, almost alien. Alex stared at the blank screen for a long time before finally typing. "I was wrong," she wrote. "What I've said before was based on lies and ignorance. The truth is far more complex, far more devastating, and it's time we face it." She hit publish, her hands trembling. For the first time, her words carried a different kind of weight, a responsibility to tell the truth. As the post went live, Alex felt a sense of catharsis. It was only a small step, but it was a step forward. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. Dear reader, the moral of this and many other stories is to question what you see on social media. Remember, someone always has an ulterior motive. Seek the truth, and above all, approach every narrative with empathy and a willingness to understand.